Hi, everybody. This is Sam.
And this is Dillon, and welcome to the Church Chatter podcast.
So this is episode 6, and today we are talking about marriage and what Christianity says about marriage. And we have so much information. We actually have had to cut some out for this, so it's not incredibly long. So there's a lot more that we could say, and maybe one day will say. But we do want to start out with a kind of content warning for this episode. We touch on, you can't talk about the history of marriage within Christianity without also talking about enslavement. So we do talk about some violence that was committed against enslaved people. So if that's difficult for you to hear, just know that. We talk about violence against women because you can't talk about marriage without talking about the violence that has been done against women. So just know that we do talk about some of these things. Okay.
And also, this is not just marriage in the Christian tradition, but obviously because Christians come out of the Jewish tradition, right. We'll also be talking about the Hebrew scriptures, which is the Jewish understanding of things, or at least the historic Jewish understanding of things. And so we will also be talking about that as well.
Yeah. Okay. So let's start this episode by talking about how we're going to talk a lot of crap on marriage, it seems, I think, in this episode. And we're going to really complicate it, right? But we do want to start out by saying we are pro-marriage and we are pro-commitment. And we think that if that is something that you want, that's a beautiful thing. We also think that marriage, we want to be really upfront about this, is not the only path to love and fulfillment, right?
Yes, I would agree with that.
So I want to say that right up front. So because this is about marriage, I want to start out by talking about marriage. But again, just know that marriage is not everybody's goal, and that's beautiful. Great. So let's talk about the value of marriage in society. So marriage does have some pros before we talk about how complicated the history of it is, some pros and cons. So first, for me and a lot of people that I know, if you live a life by yourself, it's very easy to not be confronted with your flaws. Our trauma, our wounds are exposed within the context of community and close committed relationships. In our current society, that often means in marriage or committed partnership. It can also mean a very close friendship within family, within communities, right? This is where our trauma is exposed. I know that a lot of people, when they first get married, this is whenever they become aware of a lot of their flaws that can be problematic. But also within this commitment is where the healing is too. So our problems become evident in community, but also this is where the healing is. So I hope that makes sense to those of you who have been in relationships before. I'm sure it does. So this is where the healing can be as well. So marriage does serve a lot of purposes, spiritually, emotionally, also economically, which we're going to talk about. However, our ideas of what a marriage is has always been evolving and shifting and is messy. And I'm going to be bold and say that the Bible is probably not the best place to go for marriage wisdom. So let's just start by talking about, Dylan does a lot of weddings, and I get to go to some of those weddings. And I find it really interesting that the readings that people choose to be read at weddings, which are beautiful, keep choosing them, go for it. But just a little context. So the part of the Bible that says love is patient, love is kind, right? In 1 Corinthians, this is read a lot at weddings, which is the beginning of a marriage. And this is not about romantic love, and this is not about marriage. This is actually, so 1 Corinthians is a letter that Paul wrote to Chloe's people. Chloe is the name of a woman who was a leader of these Jesus followers, or this Jesus community after Jesus had died in Corinth. So that's where we get Corinthians. And they were fighting about how to organize their community. They were fighting about who should speak in tongues, does tongues exist, who shouldn't speak in tongues, who should translate, who's the leader, what are people's roles, what's the best role, what's the worst role, all of these things. So Paul was writing a letter to Chloe's people in Corinth, telling them that they need to love each other, essentially. You need to love each other. And if you're worshiping God, this is the source of love. And if you're doing that, then you can love each other from that source, from that place, and everything else will take care of itself, right? So he was talking about love, yes, but not in the context of a romantic relationship. Another verse or section of the Bible that is read a lot is So that line, Dylan, what is it? Where you go, I will go.
Where you go, I will go. And
Yeah.
from the book of Ruth.
Yes. And this is between a daughter-in-law and a mother-in-law. So the daughter-in-law's son, who is also, or the daughter-in-law's husband, who is also the mother-in-law's son, had just died. Traditionally, if your husband dies and there's no brother for you to marry, you have to leave and go find another husband, because as a woman, you don't have a job, you have no way of supporting yourself, you have to go find a new man. But we have here Ruth saying to Naomi, her mother-in-law, I'm not leaving you. Wherever you go, I'm going. There's also a lot of immigrant stuff here because she goes to another country. But this, again, is between a daughter-in-law and a mother-in-law, not a romantic partnership, not a marriage, right? So I just think that's really interesting that we will pull things from the Bible thinking they have to do with marriage or romantic love, but that's not true. So just to kind of introduce this topic, we're really going to complicate it today. Let's just ask the question, is there much said about marriage in the Bible? So I'll start by saying marriage as we know it in our culture today, the Bible doesn't really talk about that, right? This idea of like family values, the Bible's not the place to go for that. And this is what I mean. Abraham impregnates his slave, who was not his wife. David had multiple wives. Solomon had hundreds of concubines. Mary was an unwed pregnant teenager. Jesus was an unwed man, and he didn't have children, and this was socially unacceptable during this time. Paul often aligned himself against marriage for a lot of complicated reasons. So all of these characters in the Bible that are lifted up, they did not show us an example of marriage as we know and value it today.
So, first, right off the bat, as a human, I love marriages. I think they are a wonderful thing. I don't always think they're the best thing, but they are a wonderful thing and a great institution that is both for us while we're here on earth, but also I do believe that marriage, that God is a part of that marriage. So many pastors will joke, and obviously you know I'm a pastor. Many pastors will joke that, I'd much rather do a funeral than a wedding. I am not of that persuasion. I love officiating weddings. I love going to them. I love doing premarital counseling with people. I love the rituals and the ceremony around weddings. And so as a pastor, I love weddings. I think they're a wonderful thing. I think they're the best thing. So many people, because they know that I'm a pastor, will ask me, they'll say to me, Pastor, isn't the Bible clear that marriage is between one man and one woman? And as soon as I hear that, I always think, what should my response be? And the simple answer to that is no, that's not exactly what the Bible says. The Bible says a lot of things about a lot of different types of marriages. And so I'd like to first just remind us that the Bible is not one book, but a book of many books. The Bible is a library filled with lots and lots of different books. And over time, the Bible spans a time of 1,600 years, approximately 1,600 years. That's a lot of time. And over that 1,600 years, many cultures and traditions and religious understandings change over time. And if we take a really, really close look at that 1,600 years of history, we'll see that the Hebrew text or the Old Testament and in the time of Jesus and the New Testament, things start to evolve and things start to change. And so as we look very closely at that 1,600 years of history, we see that marriage also changes in the Bible.
And it's not just 1,600 years of history in one place. It's 1,600 years of history across multiple continents.
Correct.
So
yeah.
We are talking about, we have many cultures represented in the Bible. So to just point and say, like, this is how it's done, it's much more complicated than that, which is why people have been studying this thing for so long.
Yeah, absolutely. So many people, so I'd like to start with this in the Hebrew scriptures, or as Christians sometimes think of the Old Testament. You start in the book of Genesis, people will say, well, the book of Genesis says that it's Adam and Eve. So I want to give a little context here. So we do in the book of Genesis get the story of Adam and Eve. And in Genesis chapter 1, it's recorded that God creates man and woman in God's image at one time as one humanity, right? That's the first story in Genesis 1. But then in Genesis 2, it's recorded a little differently. You get a little bit of a different creation story. You get God creating man first and then woman. And in that story, in Genesis 2, you get specific names. You get Adam and you get Eve. And these are not proper names like Bill and Sally, but they still are names. And so Adam means the ground or the earth, something that comes out. And Eve means something that comes out of the earth as well. Okay? So these are not specific names like Dylan and Samantha or Bill and Sally, but there's something a little bit greater. So we have Genesis 1, in which God creates everything at once, including humanity. And then we get Genesis 2, again, that kind of separates this and starts to build this little bit of a difference between man and woman. If you look at the difference of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, once again, you'll get a little bit two different stories. They both are put together, and we read them together, but they are two different stories written over two different spans of time that have been put together. That's number one that we need to know. And we have to ask ourselves this question. Is the Adam and Eve story a story of literal history, or is it rather a story of theological understanding and a metaphorical story? So that you might have to ask yourself that question. And for me, the Adam and Eve story is a story of an archetype couple. I do not believe that Adam and Eve were the first couple that ever lived. I believe that Adam and Eve were an archetype that were given to us by God to show God's love and give us a story of creation. And the reason I have come to that conclusion is because not only have I studied the Bible academically, but studied the theology of around those biblical stories in seminary, but also if you start to read the book of Genesis, both chapters 1 and chapters 2, you will you'll find yourself running into a problem. You have Adam and Eve. They have Cain and Abel, two sons. Cain kills Abel. You go from 4 people to 3 people, and all of a sudden, things start to happen, right? And so what's going on for the institution of marriage? Who is going to be a wife or a spouse for Adam and Eve's son? You have to ask yourself that question. Once you get to Genesis 4, all of a sudden,
there's a city of people.
There is something going on here, right? So Cain goes off into the land of Nod in Genesis chapter 4, and the land of Nod means wandering. So he goes off to this place of wander, and all of a sudden you go from 3 people on the earth to him finding somebody else. So we have to ask ourselves that question: where does that person come from? And so therefore, you can't say that Adam and Eve were the only people. There were more people. This was just a very specific part of the story, once again, to show us the goodness of God in creation, and Adam and Eve are that archetype of the story, okay? So, also in the book of Genesis, you do not get any type of wedding or marriage ceremony that we would know of today. There is no priest, there is no rabbi, there is no pastor, there's no officiating of a ceremony. God's presence is there with these 2 people, yes, and we would assume that these 2 people are in a relationship together. Whether you believe that they're literal people or an archetypal people, doesn't really matter. But there is no sense of understanding the Adam and Eve story in terms of marriage that we would think about today. So when somebody says marriage is only between a man and a woman, and we see that identically and put together in the book of Genesis, that is not as clear and cut as we think.
And so it's really important to think about this. So we're talking about marriage today, and I study language and culture. Sometimes we think that culture is this fluffy thing and it makes something less real. Just because marriage shifts across time and culture and it evolves and it changes and all these things, that doesn't mean that the way our culture views it isn't real.
Correct.
Or isn't wrong. It just means that it's always in shift, and things that are culturally constructed are very real. They're just as real as our flesh, right? It's very real. So Does that make sense? I just think it's important to say that.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And let me make myself very clear. As a pastor, the Genesis story, the story of Adam and Eve, the story of creation is true. Let me make myself very clear. The story of Adam and Eve, the story given to us of creation in Genesis is true. But truth does not always mean that it has to be actual historical fact, that it happened this way, that somebody could go and dig it up and find it. Truth is something that is greater, something that is given to us by God, and it is a lesson, a moral and ethical teaching, a lesson showing us that there's something greater, that there's something here. And for me and many other mainline Protestant pastors, this story of Genesis, the story of creation, the story of Adam and Eve, the story of the two people coming together, is a greater story to show us of God's love and connection. So this does not, for me, have to be historic to be true. It is true regardless of whether it's historic.
Yeah, I just wrote down that we're going to do an episode eventually on truth versus fact, because that has an interesting linguistic history. And fact never really had a huge place in Christianity or religion until the Enlightenment. So we'll do an episode on that.
Yeah, that sounds great. All right, so gave you a little bit of background there, right, with the Genesis text, and so I would like to share this with you. There's sometimes people will say 7, sometimes people will say 8. There's a little bit of overlap. I usually like to go with 7. There's 7 different types of marriages throughout the Bible, specifically in the Hebrew text, the Old Testament. Okay, and marriage in the ancient world, especially marriage in the Bible, in the Hebrew Scriptures, was mostly, if not exclusively, either arranged or it was forced. The men were in control, and the women were viewed as property of the men. And you went through a process of marriage. Marriage was not like we have today, where usually a man would give a ring to a woman, and in a couple months they'd have a wedding ceremony, or they something like that. It's a kind of a quick turnover. Or we also there is a same-sex marriage now, at least in the United States, and so couples will get together and they'll get engaged, and then they'll get married, and there's different things around that. In the ancient world, that was not how it was. The first thing would be a betrothal, okay? And that has to do with something that happened in the past, the arrangement, okay? So you would be, a woman would be betrothed to someone. And then would come the official arrangement and purchase. The man would purchase the woman because the woman was property. So first the betrothal.
And purchase the woman from her father.
Correct, from her father.
It's an exchange between men.
Yes, an exchange between men of property. Mm-hmm. First the betrothal, then the arrangement/purchase of the woman, and then the woman would move into the male household. Interesting. There is living together before marriage in the Bible. Okay?
And we are talking specifically about the history of Christianity, which is why we're talking in past tense, but we are aware that this is still true for some people on this globe today.
Yes. And then after the woman would move into the male's household, after she was betrothed and arranged and purchased, then the marriage would come a little later. And that would be the actual wedding ceremony, the wedding feast, okay? So it was a process of 4 things: betrothal, purchase, moving into the household, and then the wedding/marriage, okay? It was a lengthy process of time. So the 7 types of most popular marriages in the Bible I'd like to start with them with this. So there is monogamous marriage, and monogamous marriage is marriage between one man and one woman. If you want to go with the Adam and Eve story, you could see that between them, even though there was no specific ritual or ceremony or whatever. So monogamous marriage is between either a man and a woman, or just between 2 people. That's monogamous marriage. We see that in the Bible. From monogamous marriage, we also see it's called levirate marriage, okay? And a levirate marriage is between a widow, a woman widow, who had no son, who would need to be married, and she would be married to her brother-in-law. And this means she would leave her home, she would marry her brother-in-law, and she would be required to have sexual relations with him, whether or not she wanted to. Okay, so this was not only an arranged thing, but it was forced, and it was called levirate marriage. Some people would see this as progressive in that it would give the woman a place where she wouldn't fall into homelessness and poverty, and yet it was still arranged and forced, and she may have not liked her brother-in-law, and now she would have to be married to him.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to say is, yeah, this seems brutal, but so Dillon has a brother. That'd be like if Dillon died, I would be forced to marry his brother.
Right.
And that seems brutal, and it for sure there's brutal aspects to that, but that was also a way to make sure this woman wasn't left out alone, homeless, without anything. And Jesus even talks, and Jesus teaches against divorce. During Jesus's time, it's important to note that if a man just divorced his wife, she's kind of screwed. He's fine. He'll live on, everything will be fine, but she's screwed. She has no way to make money. She has no way to feed herself. If she has children, she doesn't have a way to support that person. So speaking out against divorce was in some ways very pro-woman. Like, no, this is the system we have to work with. So the woman needs to, if the husband dies or leaves her, we need to have an alternative here.
Right, and so in the Hebrew Scriptures of the Old Testament, you get this concept, this covenant of levirate marriage. And one of the more specific places you can find levirate marriage is in Genesis 38. From monogamous marriage and levirate marriage, you get something called monogamous property marriage. And that's marriage between one man, one woman, and the woman's property that was gifted to the man at the time of their betrothal and then moved into their marriage. So the wife's enslaved females were owned by her husband as property given to him in marriage, and these enslaved women had no special status except that they were required to have sexual relations with the man. So it was monogamous in that there was only one man and one woman, but the enslaved women were a part of the ownership that came within the marriage, and so they would have to do specific things for this man. And we see this throughout the Bible, this monogamous property marriage, but we specifically see it in Genesis 16. Then we have polygamous property marriage between one man and many wives and other female sexual partners whom the man owned as property. These sexual partners were seen as not nothing, but something lower than the man's many wives. So one man, many wives, other female sexual partners within the marriage, okay? We also see prisoner of war marriage. And prisoner of war marriage is between a male soldier and a female prisoner of war. And these marriages were not arranged, but they were forced. We see this in Numbers 31, and we see this in Deuteronomy 21. We also see it other places. These are two specific ones. And this is the idea that soldiers would go in, an army would go in, a town would be taken, the men would be killed, and the soldiers would take the women whose husbands died, and they'd take them. They were forced into marriage, forced into sexual relations, and this was permitted. This was a type of marriage in the Bible that was permitted. We also have rapist marriage, and one of the reasons why we have a content warner on this is because this is a rather heinous understanding of marriage, and yet it was one that was affirmed and supported in the biblical times, early in the biblical times. So rapist marriage is between one man and one woman, and these types of marriages were once again forced. You see this in Deuteronomy chapter 2, in which a man would forcibly put himself upon a woman. She would get pregnant, and then she was forced to marry the very person who raped her, and this was permitted. And we would never want that or allow for that today, and yet in the Bible it was permitted. Okay. One of the last ones we have is enslaved marriage, and enslaved marriage is between one man and one woman who were both enslaved. except that these men and women who were enslaved, these marriages were once again not arranged, but they were forced, and they were forced by the slave owner, the one who enslaved them. So the slave owner or the slave master would say, I have a woman who is enslaved, I have a man who's enslaved, and I don't care if you don't like each other, now you're going to get married and you're going to have children so that you can produce more enslaved people for me so that I can keep up what I need to do. So there are these 7 different types of things. I would like to remind us that all of these things, all 7 of these marriages, monogamous marriage, levirate marriage, monogamous property marriage, polygamous property marriage, prisoner of war marriage, rapist marriage, enslaved marriage, are all affirmed and supported in the Bible. Now, one that reads the Bible can take different things and interpret different things for that and say, well, I support that or I don't support that, and that's fine. We can all have opinions on what the Bible says, and that has been the same thing for centuries, and yet all 7 of these, and there's other types of laws that we're not even talking about here that were common in the time, all of those things were supported by the Bible as types of appropriate marriages.
And Christianity and Judaism, there are some expressions of Christianity today that will have us believe that the Bible is where Christianity stops, that it starts and ends with the Bible. That's it. Christianity has never and will never be contained by the Bible. It has always gone beyond the Bible. The Bible is not the end all be all. I'm not saying it's nothing, for sure. That's not what I'm saying. Don't try me for heresy here. But Christianity practices, Christianity beliefs have always extended. Christian texts have extended beyond biblical texts. The Jewish faith had the Talmud, which was like commentaries on the Hebrew Bible, on the Torah. So the Bible has never been, in Judaism or Christianity, the end-all, be-all. So we have always had teachings that extend beyond the Bible and kind of,
including teachings and laws on marriage that
Right.
are once again outside of the scriptures.
Right.
I did forget to offer up the source of the last one. Enslaved marriage can be found specifically in Exodus chapter 21.
Yes. So one of the reasons why a lot of people want to say, like, oh, we want to be able to point to the Bible to support some of our world views is because whenever the Protestant Reformation happened about 500 years ago, the Pope was seen as the authority, and that was problematic for some people, and that's one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why Protestantism was born. I'm really simplifying things here. But Protestants needed an authority that was like the Pope. So what did they say? They said the Scripture is authority. They started translating it into languages that the common people could read. So now, for 500 years, there's been this pressure to point, the same way Catholics throughout history have pointed to the Pope as their authority, Protestants have pointed to the Bible as our authority. And as we know, that's problematic because one man, the Pope, can't be the authority on all things. That's flawed. And one thing, the Bible can't be the authority on all things. That's also flawed, right? It can't work, as we're seeing.
Right.
Including with marriage. We can't point to the Bible as our authority on what marriage should and can be.
Sure. So those are some very specific understandings of marriage, specifically in the Hebrew text in the Old Testament. But I would like to share very briefly some of the teachings of Jesus, and then some of the teachings also in the New Testament that have to do with marriage. So first off, Jesus himself, Samantha said this in the very beginning, Jesus himself was never married. There is not any type of true evidence that would point that Jesus was married. Some people have talked about him being romantic with Mary Magdalene and perhaps secretly married, but those are all kind of fringe understandings of things. I don't want to dismiss them totally. I myself personally, as both a person, as a Christian and as a pastor, there is no historic evidence that we have found that Jesus was ever married or connected romantically to any specific person for a long period of time. So Jesus himself was never married. He was a single person. And so we know that. And Jesus is recorded in the 4 Gospels to support monogamous marriage between 2 people. Now, in Jesus' day, marriage was between a man and a woman, because that was the tradition, mostly of the Jewish people at the time in the Second Temple period of Judaism. So monogamous marriage between a man and a woman. Jesus did, excuse me, keep with that. But once again, Jesus himself, it was common for two people to come together in the Jewish faith and the Jewish tradition and get married. Well, once again, Jesus himself was not married. Jesus speaks against divorce. And Samantha talked about this a little bit. Jesus speaks against divorce in the Gospels, and that's for the simple reason that there was a lot of, as I call it, loosey-goosey practices going on with the men of the day. Men of the day were very loosey-goosey in being able to just dismiss their wives and get rid of them and put their children out on the street because they wanted other sexual partners. And so all of a sudden you could say to your wife, okay, I want you out, I want the children out. And this contributed to high levels of poverty and homelessness. And Jesus was seeing this. And so Jesus did speak against divorce for the simple reason in the historic time of Jesus that there were high levels of poverty and homelessness between women and children. And he wanted those women to have a support that they would be able to do what they could do in the confines and covenant of marriage. In the Gospel of St. Matthew, Jesus says something very interesting. He is recorded to say that marriage is an earthly union, meaning that marriage is something that we come together, two people come together. Sometimes they have children, sometimes they don't have children, but this idea of coming together in this covenant, this union, this marriage between two people is not something that carries on into the afterlife. So it is something that just happens here, and it's not something that goes on after we die. So that's an interesting teaching that he has on marriage. And then concerning same-sex relationships, same-sex partnerships, same-sex marriage, Jesus is silent on these relationships and has said nothing about prohibiting them among mutually loving adults. I, as a Lutheran pastor, the Lutheran Church has expanded marriage in terms of marriage equality. We marry straight couples as well as same-sex couples because we believe that the union between two people who are monogamous and adults expands and can show God's love. And so Jesus didn't say anything specific to that. So we include marriage for everyone. So that has kind of been an expansive teaching on God's love shown in marriage, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. And Jesus is also on the record in the Gospels for promoting and affirming the practice of singleness. And singleness in the day, what was deeply uncommon, very uncommon. This practice had to do with the development of one's life with God, so one's life with God and neighbor, and a greater understanding of the kingdom of God. So once again, we see Jesus as a single person. We see Jesus promoting singleness, but also marriage. And St. Paul, in a lot of St. Paul's letters, St. Paul also supports singleness. And he speaks of marriage, he speaks of marriage rather interestingly. He says, basically, you should remain single, be devoted to God, be devoted to neighbor, and be devoted to the life and teachings of Jesus to make the world a better place until the kingdom fully comes. But if you have to get married and you're burning with sexual passions, then I guess you should come together and you should be married. Interesting. So he says, basically, if you can't control yourself, then get married. If not, remain single and live the teachings of Jesus. From the very beginning of the Christian tradition, singleness has been one of these things that has been really lifted up. Many of the early Christians, many of them that were named and we know, and their stories, They were single people. They were unmarried people. They did not have children, and they were uplifted. Now, that doesn't mean that singleness is better than those who are married or those who are married and have children. That's not what I'm saying. But the Christian tradition, coming outside of the Jewish tradition, it is not just get married only between a man and a woman and have children. That is not the only story. That is one part of the story, but that is not the only story. There is a lot of different options that are given and supported and affirmed by both Jesus and St. Paul and others in the New Testament, and even those in the Jewish scriptures.
And a man and a woman getting married and having babies has been the story that has been centralized throughout modern history in the past few centuries, or I'd even say a couple thousand years maybe, and evolving to this. It's been centralized, but that by no means it's the best option for somebody's life. But it has been centralized in our society.
I know many people in my own life, in my own congregation, who have and are single people. They are very fulfilled. They love God. They love neighbor. They follow the teachings of Jesus, and they live a very fulfilled life as a single person.
Yeah.
I also see people who are married and have no children and live a very fulfilled life. I see people who are married and have lots of children and they are of a fulfilled life. I also see same-sex couples who are married and follow the teachings of Jesus and have a very fulfilled life.
Beautiful families, step-parents, right? Step-parents are like the unsung heroes of our day. They get no credit, but they're there, right? So yeah, families come in all. So marriage is actually a really tricky thing to talk about because you don't want to offend everybody. So which is why we're like really trying to make the point that like, yes, of course, liberation, do whatever it is, like follow the path that unfolds in front of you. Beautiful. For me, from my perspective, marriage for me has been a deeply spiritual experience. Now, if you know me, you know that I've been married before and divorced. So I've experienced divorce as well. But so being married to Dillon has been a spiritual experience in that, and I don't mean a religious experience, I just mean spiritual, deeply emotional as well. This like, if I'm working on something where I'm like, oh man, I really need to be I don't know, I'm trying to think of something. Like I'll just talk about the beginning of Dillon and I's marriage because I'm okay getting vulnerable publicly. I was a very stoic, unemotional person. If you ask me to talk about my feelings, no way. I don't even have feelings. What are those? I'm fine. Everything's fine. Keep going, keep achieving, keep moving, keep climbing the ladder. Go. And then I realized that was a problem. Thankfully, I did that before I became a mother, and a mother really broke me open like it does for a lot of people. But I had to work on becoming a more emotional. That is a difficult thing. It's a difficult thing to do and to heal out in the wild. The context of marriage or just committed partnership is a space in our society that can be protected and allows you to practice healing. I hope that makes sense. So
it's very good.
For me, I think that marriage can be deeply spiritual and healing. Again, for me, it's not the only space that this kind of stuff occurs, but in our current setup, it is one of them. It's one of the more prominent ones that people have access to. And
I would agree and share that with you.
Okay, so I want to talk about paterfamilias. So you didn't think, if you've been listening to all of our episodes so far, you probably have been wondering, when is Sam going to bring up the Roman Empire? She hasn't talked about the Roman Empire yet. Well, here it is. We're going to talk about the Roman Empire. So if you haven't listened to the first 5 episodes, Jesus, 2,000 years ago, lived during a time when the Roman Empire conquered Jerusalem and ruled over the Jews, to put it simply. So families within the Roman Empire were set up the exact same way as the greater society of the empire. And this means with a male head of household. And that language continues today. This concept was called the paterfamilias. So the emperor was the paterfamilias of the Roman territories, and the male head of household was the paterfamilias of his specific household, including his wife, children, and enslaved people. So enslaved members of the household. So the paterfamilias had authority over every aspect of their household's life. financial, social, legal, even disciplining members of his household. So the position of the paterfamilias was central to the Roman social structure, and which was patriarchal and in place at the beginning of Christianity. So we need to understand that Christianity comes from the Jesus story, and the Jesus story is so heavily impacted by the Roman Empire, which was a patriarchal society. It had this paterfamilias system where the emperor was seen as the paterfamilias, who was male, and he was in charge of all the Roman territories, and every male in his household was seen as the paterfamilias, meaning he was in charge of everybody. So thankfully, throughout Christian history and history in general, in some places of the world, this is beginning to unravel, thank goodness. So when Christians today refer to family values or they point to the Bible for things about marriage, they are often pointing back to the values modeled in the paterfamilias system that the Roman Empire was actively enforcing during Jesus' lifetime. A male who left the home to provide financially for his family and engage in public life, and a female who stayed home to engage in domestic labors for her family. However, we cannot romanticize this paterfamilias reality. We cannot, because that is deeply problematic to everybody involved. This male head of household structure, we can't romanticize it because it has a long history of being damaging to everybody, including the male. So here's what I mean. The typical family had enslaved members of the household. Many of these enslaved people, following the death of Jesus, were Jews. And because the Jews revolted against the Roman Empire, so if you know anything about the Jewish revolt, about 30 years, so in the year 66, about 30 years after Jesus had died, the Jews had revolted against the Roman Empire and they had won. And they enjoyed liberation for 4 years. And then the Roman soldiers came back in the year 70. And the Romans very violently and very brutally took back control of Jerusalem. They killed a lot of Jews. Many of these Jews who were not killed were stripped naked. So this is another reason why we have the content warning. These Jews were stripped naked, beaten publicly, and marched through the city in like a parade type event. Naked, beaten, and then they were enslaved by the Romans. So we're talking over 100,000 Jews is what scholars estimate. Jews who were enslaved. Also, people who couldn't pay off their debts or afford to live were also enslaved in the Roman Empire paterfamilias system. So all of this is to say that the Romans had a lot of slaves. Even Romans who were not particularly well off, they most likely had slaves, right? You didn't have to be rich to enslave somebody. So a household was built around the assumption that they would have free labor in the forms of enslaved people. A household couldn't function without enslaved people, right? So to have a male head of household, it actually couldn't function without the abuse of these enslaved people. And there were these slave markets where enslaved people were taken by their male head of household or their paterfamilias, enslaver, to be traded. And enslavers would have to try to make their enslaved look young and healthy so they could trade them for more. And the enslaved could be bought or rented out for a period of time based on their special skills. And of course, all of the brutality that comes with enslavement. Mothers and fathers being ripped from their children, just terrible, terrible things. So all this is to say that if we romanticize this male head of household, this paterfamilias system, we are also romanticizing enslavement because the male head of household, this paterfamilias system, could not exist without enslavement. Because the paterfamilias system fell apart without enslaved labor. Something really telling is that the Roman Senate actually ruled against uniforms for enslaved members of the household because they were afraid that out in society, if you could easily see who else was enslaved, if they could easily be spotted, the enslaved people would realize how many enslaved people there actually were, and they would revolt against the system. That's how many there were. So the Roman Senate said, no, we can't put uniforms on them. They have to just look like anybody else when we're traveling with our family. Otherwise, they'll revolt. So that's really telling just to see like this level of control. So to desire a family modeled after the paterfamilias system is to accept the cruelty of enslavement as part of this family and economic system. This was harmful to the enslaved people, but it was also harmful to other people in the home. So males with unchecked power in their homes and in society become violent in pursuit of more power. How about that? And listen, if you don't believe that, just look around. We have played patriarchy out and it's not going well. When you give men uncontrolled power. They can just do anything. We've played this to the end, right? And it's not working out. So this is demonstrated throughout humanity's violent patriarchal history. There's domestic abuse, there's global war, and we have let this paterfamilias system play out. It's not going well. So the male having ultimate authority in the home, it was harmful also to the females in the house. So the enslaved people, yes, first and foremost, so much harm, so much abuse. And we still see remnants of that today in our society. But the predatory male heads of household, because they had all this power, again, content warning from the beginning of this, they would use enslaved boys and girls for their sexual desires. This was, of course, first and foremost, harmful to these enslaved children. It was also harmful to the wives. They were jealous, they were unhappy about this, and they weren't allowed to use their voice to tell their husband, I don't like this. I don't like what you're doing. So these wives were upset. And again, these enslaved children, these enslaved people were harmed kind of in a double kind of way, because these wives couldn't tell the paterfamilias of their home, their husband, that they didn't like what they were doing. So they were angry. These wives were angry, but they couldn't express this anger to their husband. So who did they express it towards? The enslaved children in the household who this was happening to. So again, just problematic all the way down. If we romanticize biblical marriage, if we romanticize male head of household, this is also what we are romanticizing.
Also, I want to make a note here that many of you might say, yeah, but it says in Ephesians and it says in Colossians that women are to respect their husbands and they're to submit to their husbands. Well, that's what it might say in Ephesians and Colossians, which are a lot later editions when the early Christian people are trying to settle themselves and not be separate from that of the empire. So they're embracing the paterfamilias system, the household codes, the household system of the Roman imperial cult. And they're saying, okay, we'll kind of submit to these things that you do. We'll place them on our groups, our Jesus communities, and we'll kind of live in agreement here. But the very earliest teachings and the very earliest understandings of gender roles and household codes and understandings, especially in the teachings of Jesus, especially in the teachings of St. Paul, you do not get that. Yes. The earliest writings, which are Paul's writings, even some of them in the Gospels, the earliest Christian writings, the teachings of Jesus, the writings of Paul, they are gender equality. They are egalitarian. They say that the man is not over the woman is not over the man. They are both equal. So you could argue it both ways. Someone says, oh, but this is what it says. And you say, well, what does it mean? But what does it mean about this? Yeah. What does it mean in Paul's letters? Okay, because you get something in 1 Timothy where it says a woman should not speak, she should not do these things, she should submit to her husband. Okay, but in Paul's earlier letters, it says something very different. So you can see the evolution over time of the household codes, the understandings of who has positions within the marriage, right? And once again, from the very beginning, I said these things over the 1600 years of time, give or take a little bit, these things change. There are different interpretations, different understandings, and there are people that are trying to figure out what is it that I believe, what is it that the communities believe, and it's always been sometimes different things.
And I'm about to drop a bomb on you right now. This is one of my favorite things to tell people. So my disclaimer is, I'm not a pastor like Dillon. I feel no sense of responsibility for tenderly guiding people through their faith.
Oh, gentle, be gentle.
So, scholars agree that the New Testament texts were all written after the year of 70, which means after the Jewish revolt, after the Romans in the year of 70 came back, took over Jerusalem, marched Jewish people naked and bleeding and suffering through the city, and then enslaved them. It was violent. People were killed. People were raped. It was violent. I can't express that enough.
Martyred.
Jews and Jesus followers, some of whom still identified as Jews because Christianity didn't exist yet, they were scared. So the gospel texts, the New Testament texts that we have, they were not written down. They were in circulation, but they were not written down until after this violent war. People were afraid of the Romans. So we have things in the New Testament that are written in a way where they are submitting to the Romans, even if they don't believe it. And some things were written after there was certain knowledge of how history played out, right? So
right. I mean, you hear this especially in St. Mark's Gospel, which is the oldest gospel. You hear this idea that there's wars and there's rumors of wars and nations are. That's actually the reading for this coming Sunday. You start to see these things. Why are they talking about these things? Because they themselves, these are not things that are just going to come. They're currently going on. They have been going on. These people are under duress.
Right. So the people aren't making a prediction. It's not a prophecy. They were living it.
They were living it.
It was already happening.
They were living it.
Right. Even when Jesus says that the temple's going to fall down, when that's written down, we have no way of knowing if Jesus actually said that, but we do know for sure that the people who wrote that down, they already witnessed the temple falling. History already happened. They already saw the Romans destroy the temple. So whenever we have Jesus saying the temple's going to be destroyed, well, yeah, the writers already knew it. It already happened. So that can really, listen, I'm all about complicating our relationship with the Bible. It's done everything for me and my understanding of it in a beautiful way. So let that sink in. That can complicate the whole New Testament for you. Okay, so back to the women. Even today, one place where women are given kind of just like all the control is having control and power over their children. That's the one space for women throughout history where we've been like kind of given this society sanctioned control, unfortunately. So sometimes this is where women will place their control and domination is over children. So this is what women were doing because they couldn't control their husbands. They had no control. They were being controlled by their husbands, this paterfamilias. So again, to romanticize this system, this paterfamilias system, is to forget about how much this system relies on the enslaved members to bear the abuse of both the paterfamilias and the angry wives and their misplaced anger. Okay, I still have more though. So the male head of household himself was problematic. One of my favorite things to talk about is how men also need to be liberated from this system that still goes on today, this paterfamilias system, this male head of household, right? So the word for man was vir, V-I-R, vir. You were not considered a vir because you were born as a male. So instead, you had to earn this male, this vir, this man status. You had to earn your manhood. And this was most notably seen in the gladiator fights. If you won, you were considered a man because you fought in the name of the Roman Empire. If you lost, you were also considered a man because you died in the name of the Roman Empire. So if you fought, you were considered a man no matter what. So you had this status of a vir or a man. But you could not keep this. It wasn't like a one-time thing. Oh, now you're a man forever. You had to keep fighting in these gladiator matches. The next person, the next person, the next person to keep proving that you could maintain your man status, your vir status. And it was very rare that you would remain undefeated forever. Eventually you would die in these fights. And this was the only way to have permanent manhood, permanent vir status. So you had to keep control. So that was one way to be seen as a man. Another way was you had to keep control of your household, your wife, your children, and the enslaved members of your household if you wanted to be seen as a man, as a vir. So you had to control everything around you. And control, I really like to ground things in these episodes and just in everything. To ground it, when we find ourselves trying to control other people, this is always a mask for our fear. So men were fearful. They didn't want to lose their man status. They didn't want to lose that vir status, right? So they had to control everybody. They had to make everything seem like everything was okay. And of course, if I was a man born during this time, I would be scared too. If I was born into a system that required me to keep all of the people around me in my household behaving in a certain way. And we continue to see this today. Boys and men are expected to work so hard to keep proving that they're a man. Just like in the gladiator fights 2,000 years ago, boys and men are still being expected to use violence as a way to prove themselves to be good enough and strong enough and worthy enough in our society. We still see it, but Jesus was playing a different game. He was not working to keep his man or vir status. In fact, Jesus was more similar to the enslaved members of households in the paterfamilias system. So he was born just 50 years later, and if he was born 50 years later, he would have lived during the Jewish revolt, and he likely would have either died or become an enslaved member of a Roman household, right? So Jesus was more like the enslaved people. Even more than that, Jesus was born into a family in the very poor town of Nazareth. So him and the people that he grew up with, the people he loved, were at constant risk of becoming enslaved if they could not find a way to afford their life. So Jesus identified more with the enslaved people than with the paterfamilias. And we actually have an example in the Bible where he was likely calling out paterfamilias. So there's this popular story in the Bible of a paralyzed man being lowered into a home to be healed by Jesus. This man was brought in on a portable bed, and he was described as I don't know if I'm going to say this right, a paralyticos. I'm really
paralytic.
Yes, it's translated into English as a paralytic. Yeah. So the fact that this man was on a portable bed that had to be carried by 4 people implies that he likely had wealth, but also that these 4 people were enslaved. They were enslaved members of his household. The original Greek doesn't give identities to these 4 people at all. So they're described as these kind of like people without identities in the original Greek. But some English translations have decided to refer to these 4 people as friends of the paralytic. That is very unlikely during this time that 4 friends were just carrying you around. What is much more likely is that these 4 people were enslaved members, because this is the kind of thing that enslaved members of society would do. So these 4 people vandalized the roof of the house in order to lower the paralytic, to lower the man into where Jesus was. And the way Jesus responds has intense meaning if we read it knowing that the identity of these 4 people is they were enslaved people, right? So this man is lowered into the house so Jesus can heal him. And Jesus says to the 4 enslaved people that their pistis, which is often translated as faith, but also means loyalty, has saved them. So their loyalty has saved them. This doesn't mean that they were saved because they had faith in Jesus's healing abilities, but that their loyalty to their enslaver has saved them. And hang in there with me, because this is what that means. They were being forced to be loyal to their enslaver, but in this kind of setup, there were 2 options. You're either the enslaver or the enslaved. And Jesus is saying that the fact that they were loyal to their enslaver as enslaved people has saved them. It has saved them from what? From the corruption that comes from being something besides the enslaved, which is the enslaver. So their loyalty to their enslaver saved them, because that means they're not the enslavers. They're not enslaving people. They're not the people who are corrupt by power. They're not blinded by power. So they are saved because they are lowly. And we have the Bible everywhere saying the meek are saved, the lowly are the good ones that are going to inherit the kingdom of heaven, and all these things. This is what Jesus was saying. If you are not the ones with the power, that means you're saved from being corrupt and blinded. So that's what he was saying to these 4 people. He was saying that their lowly identities, which forces their loyalty to their enslaver, has saved them from the corruption that has fallen on the social elites. And then Jesus says something really interesting to the paralytic that he just healed, who was likely an enslaver. Like a majority of the Romans of the time, right? So a majority of the Romans, because they were corrupted by power, had enslaved people. So Jesus tells this man, he says in this story that's in the Bible, he tells him to take up his bed and walk. And if you're just reading it, you can kind of pass over this. Take up your bed and walk. What is he telling this man? He's telling this man, carry your bed yourself now. Do your own work. In other words, he's freeing the enslaved from this man's labors now. He's saying, I healed you. Now take your bed and go, because these 4 people are not going to carry your bed now. I love that. I love that. Good. Yeah. So we do subtly have there. If this is interesting to you, there's a book called God's Ghostwriters, which is all about how enslavement and how it impacted the Bible as we know it. Read it. It's called God's Ghostwriters. It's very good. So I talk about this story from the Bible because Jesus was calling out the paterfamilias system. He was telling the paterfamilias, the paralytic, to do his own labors, right? He was calling this whole system out. Again, he wasn't interested in keeping this paterfamilias system in place. He was calling it out. He wasn't calling out marriage directly, but he was calling out this system that had everything to do with oppression. The last point I want to make is the paterfamilias system, marriage and economy have everything to do with each other. The paterfamilias system shows us that the way we arrange our family life always says something more about the society at large. The paterfamilias system of the home with the male head of household is also how the Roman Empire was arranged. The emperor was seen as the male head of household, and the empire controlled the economy and things like trade and taxes. So marriage and economy are so closely linked. Family life and the economy are so closely linked, even today. So when we have an economic system built on the back of unpaid labor from enslaved people and the domestic unpaid labor from women, it is harmful to everybody. When we have an economic system that places the full burden of achievement and control on men, it is harmful to men too. When men are expected to be in control of everybody around them in order to maintain their power, that's a problem, right? They had to be in constant control over all aspects of their household's lives, including their use of language, the way their body looked, the shape and form of their body, their table manners, especially if out in public, the conduct and the image of the members of their household. They always had to look good, right? So we put the nervous systems of men in a high alert state, and research supports this. There's so much research that shows throughout history and even in present day, the nervous system of men, even if they don't identify as anxious people, it's in a high alert state because they're always trying to achieve that status, and they're always trying to control in certain ways. And I think that's really interesting. And this doesn't allow for space for men to be fully human, right? If it's a male head of household, they don't get to have the full human experience. They don't have the space to break down. They don't have the space. I have heard so many stories of men in our male head of household system today. Men lose their jobs and they don't tell their wives for weeks. They're so embarrassed. They don't have the space to fail like a human being does, which is crazy to me. So we're putting them in a box, and men are screaming in their own way to be taken out of the box. Here's just a couple quick stats about how this system is a problem in the context of marriage and family. A majority of suicides are men. 97, let this sink in, 97% of murders globally are committed by men. So when we say that the human race is violent, we're actually saying that men are violent. And this is a problem. And I am not saying this to demonize men. I'm saying it in an effort to liberate men. We need to see that men, too, are the victims of this paterfamilias system, of this male head of household system that they happen to be at the top of. And do they reap the benefits of that power? For sure. But also they are victims of it. It's a problem. It's not good for their nervous systems. It's not good. And I'm really generalizing here because things are for sure changing. But throughout history, it's a problem, right? So men too have to be liberated. It was true during Jesus's time, and it's true now. And we cannot undo this system overnight, but we can change marriages pretty quickly, right? So marriage, specifically right now, I'll talk about marriage between a man and a woman. We are beginning to see gender roles being challenged in a big way. And people are breaking free from these kind of paterfamilias boxes that were decided thousands of years ago by the Roman Empire and still linger in society today. People are breaking out of that, right? Which is beautiful. Obviously and beautifully, gay marriage is legal, and a majority of the United States supports this, right? So another interesting thing is I'm a professor, and I have so many 18 and 19-year-old young men who are doing research papers in my classes. They are interested in researching just anything related to boys and men expressing emotion. They're so interested in it because there's just this new kind of manhood that's coming onto the scene, and we're really evolving in a way that I think is a great thing. So all of that is to say that marriage, as it was expressed in the paterfamilias society, is part of the whole system that Jesus was fighting against. And if you've listened to our past few episodes, you're starting to get an understanding, if you didn't already know, what that system was, right? And the paterfamilias system, which had everything to do with what family life and marriage looked like, was part of what Jesus was fighting against. So he wasn't fighting against marriage, but he was fighting against that system with that male head of household and that like one person in charge with the power. And it was harmful to everybody. And as time goes on, we do continue to challenge marriage as a system that can be harmful to some people.
Definitely. And so Jesus indeed did challenge the paterfamilias system that was prevalent in the Roman Empire and expanded. And just for some from closing remarks from me, sometimes people will come to me and they'll say, God created man and woman in Genesis, okay? And that is true. Yet, that's not, once again, the whole story. We see that in the creation story, in the book of Genesis, that God creates humanity, right? And God creates humanity, and God creates humanity in God's image to show love and grace and kindness and goodness and all these things, right? But as time evolves, as the understanding, the institution, the covenant of marriage that God has given us evolves, the Holy Spirit brings us into understanding new things. You get in the teachings of Jesus, and specifically in the earliest letters of St. Paul in the New Testament, you get something with marriage that is starkly, starkly different from the ages and ages past. You get Jesus saying that the two will become one flesh, meaning there is not just this separation of male and female, but when the marriage comes, it is this union of something totally, totally new. Something totally new. St. Paul speaks of this as well. He speaks about in Galatians, he talks about there is no male and female. When one is baptized, they are made new in Christ Jesus. They're given a total new identity. When a person is married, whether it's a woman or a man, two women or two men, they become something new. They become one flesh, a gift given to us by God. When we see someone get baptized, there is no distinction of gender and sexual orientation. There is a new identity in God. All of these things, all of who we are brought into us. They're made new in God through Jesus Christ. And so when we think that it is only one way, that it's always been one way, no, God, through God's Spirit, continues to share the goodness of God's love in the covenant and institution of marriage, and in the new identity that we follow in Jesus. And so marriage is an ever-evolving thing. And it's good to, as a Christian and as a pastor, I uphold marriage between two people, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity, because marriage equality matters. It matters deeply to people, and it's never just been one way. And so I hope that some of our things with the paterfamilias system and family values and marriage have helped you. And just know that that we remain open to what God continues to speak to us about.
We could go on, but you might hear our kid crying. She's waking up from a nap, so we've got to go. Follow us on Instagram at church_chatter_podcast. Thanks.
Thanks.